This is Ed Driscoll for PJmedia.com, and we're talking today with Dr. Helen Smith. If you're a longtime reader of her blog at PJmedia.com, she needs no introduction. But for those stumbling into this podcast from elsewhere, Helen is a psychologist specializing in forensic and men's issues. She holds a PhD from the University of Tennessee and master's degrees from the New School for Social Research and the City University of New York. And she's the wife of Glenn Reynolds of Instapundit.com. She's also the author of the brand new book, Men on Strike: Why Men Are Boycotting Marriage, Fatherhood, and the American Dream, and Why It Matters. It's published by Encounter Books and available from Amazon.com and your local bookstore. And Helen, thanks for stopping by today.
Well, thanks so much for having me on your show, Ed.
Helen, Ayn Rand originally titled Atlas Shrugged, The Strike. Concurrent with Barack Obama taking office, the words Going Galt became a more or less household phrase, especially for entrepreneurs and those who are self-employed. So, are men in particular going on strike? And if so, in a nutshell, what's causing it?
Well, my book is basically about men going on strike, and sort of reading Ayn Rand sort of got me thinking about it. I had talked about the term on my blog about 4 or 5 years ago, and I sort of talked about going Galt during the Obama administration, and that's sort of just withdrawing your production from the world and not producing in the sense that because you feel like you are not getting a reward for what you're doing and that there are punishments. And I think in that same vein, we have men today, and I think even more so than women, who are sort of going on strike. And what's happening is the basic message of my book is that men are acting rationally. The rewards for men in the fields of things like marriage, education, careers, and fatherhood are a lot less than they used to be, and the costs and the dangers are higher. So they're opting out. I mean, kind of like people, opt out when the taxes get so high. Some people just quit producing as much. And I think in the same vein, as you noted, I think men are not, it's not that they're not producing as much. I think that they're thinking about production more along the lines, not just to, it used to, I think men were more ready to give themselves over to families and wanted to do things for women, like provide for them and that sort of thing. But now that times have changed, unfortunately, I think the traditional, the feelings on the part of women and society are such that men are supposed to still do those things that are traditional, but at the same time, women have special privileges in the law and in marriage and in a lot of ways. And I don't think we've changed the incentives for men.
Helen, there's an astonishing quote early on in your book by Helen Smith, advocate for male paternity fraud victims, who says, quote, "Enslavement used to be based on race. Now it's based on gender," close quote. Helen, could you talk a bit about the history of how we got to this point? If you watch TV's Mad Men, for example, you get the impression that prior to, I guess, about 1968 or so, men were brutish beasts who treated women like dirt on the job, cheated like sailors on their wives, and then feminism arrived in the 1970s and men and women became equals. That's not exactly what happened, though, is it?
That's not really exactly what happened. In the old days, we had in the 19th century something called coverture, and it meant that the woman's rights were sort of subsumed by that of a man in a marriage. But in today's world, according to, I interviewed different people, experts in the field, and one of them was Michael Higdon, who's a law professor at the University of Tennessee, and he explained to me that coverture now is held in the hands of women. Coverture means that those rights are sort of subsumed by the woman, and men's rights only go as far as women allow them to go. For example, there are just many aspects when it comes to things like children. If a man gets divorced, only 10% of the time does he get the custody of the kids. Who pays most of the alimony in the United States? About 97% of it is paid by men. And there are even fights now over permanent alimony and that type of thing, where a woman can literally, if she's married a particular length of time, can get permanent, or not even that long, can get permanent alimony from a man. And I think that what's happened is we've gone from a man-centric society, maybe like you were talking about the Mad Men, although my sense is it's probably somewhat of an exaggeration. What I want to point out is during coverture that men were somewhat held responsible. Of course there were atrocities committed towards women, and there were legal damages and things like that. But now we're turning them around, and when they happen to men in our society, people think that's okay. And during coverture, if women did something that society, like did something illegal, a man was held responsible and he might have to go to jail. But now it's turned around to where if men do anything, for example, if a woman says he committed domestic violence, he can go to jail, often without any due process rights or anything. Men are put in jail for owing child support. In fact, Fathers and Families, who I think it's changed their name now to the National Shared Parent Organization, they did a study in Massachusetts, and they found that something like 96% of those people going to jail for child support arrears were men, and they found that men were 8 times more likely to be put in jail if they owed child support than women. And so something about that is wrong when the majority of people are male. And going back to the quote that you talked about in the beginning, by Cornell Smith, I think it's just popular in our culture. It's accepted in our culture that we can be biased against men because they're the last group, pretty much, it's okay to be biased against without a whole lot of repercussions.
There's a statistic in your book that I didn't know. You write that, quote, in 2010, the latest suicide statistics show that 38,364 people killed themselves nationally, and 30,277 of those were men, unquote. One suicide is a man you mentioned in your book named Thomas Bell, whom you describe as, quote, a man who set himself on fire on the courthouse steps because he felt jerked around by family court, was barely worth mentioning on the evening news for his dramatic ending. Ball, a 58-year-old New Hampshire man, stated that he was, quote, done being bullied for being a man by the family court system, unquote. Which I guess leads to a two-part question. Do people believe that the suicide rate is that skewed towards men? And do they give any thought as to the reason why?
Good question. No, I think when you hear about suicide, people think about who attempts suicide. And those people who attempt suicide, women tend to do that more often. And usually either women will get help or they don't tend to use a lethal means. But men tend to, I think women do it more as a cry for help, whereas men do it sort of in hopelessness. At least that's from my 20-year experience working with men who are suicidal. And I think it's just sort of a final thing for them. But our society, when you actually look at the media, they always, even on a suicide site, they'll often have a picture of a woman, or they'll talk about getting women help. But we really don't think about men. Our society is not empathetic to men in the same sense that they're empathetic to women. We don't help them get the mental health care that they might need. And in addition, men won't go for mental health care. And as a practitioner, I truly believe this is because in part, of course, it's conditioning. Men, of course, to some degree are conditioned to believe that they don't need any help. They are more fearful to ask for help. But it's with good reason. It's because a lot of times if men do complain, they're seen as being a whiner, and there just isn't the societal outpouring of empathy that we have for a woman who has emotional problems. So when men are depressed, they're left on their own to solve the problem. I think men are also reluctant to go to a mental health practitioner, the majority of whom are women. And I've heard from so many men, this is a bit anecdotal, but I've heard from so many men that they'll go to a therapist, and they will tend to be more oriented towards women, or they won't really understand the male point of view as well. And I think that tends to make men feel that there isn't any help available, or that they would be reluctant to go. And so, yes, I think our society, and I don't think our society sees it as important. If men kill themselves, it's just, another man gone, and we see men. There's this feeling in our society that men are expendable. And I think that's unfortunate, and I think that perception needs to change.
Well, what role does academia play in creating these anti-male perceptions? Glenn wrote The Higher Education Bubble last year, which explored a myriad of problems with America's university system, not the least of which are its costs, in which students rack up tens of thousands of dollars in student loans to get often useless degrees. But how are some of the ways that college is particularly stacked against men?
Well, I think that, first of all, goes back even before college, where men or boys actually in high schools or before I think that it's not an experience that a lot of boys can feel connected to. I think the schools have a lot of female-oriented activities. The readings that they do in schools tend to be more oriented towards girls. For example, they might have some politically correct information from Toni Morrison or other books that boys don't really want to read. There's even been studies, for example, there was a study done by the London School of Economics that found that boys receive lower marks by female teachers, and that also a lot of times their behavior is evaluated and they get a mark based on behavior as opposed to merit. The competitiveness in schools, the sort of politically correct atmosphere is worse for boys than it is for girls. And I don't think it's good for girls either, believe me. I'm not saying that, but I think for boys who tend to be maybe more individualistic or less likely to conform, less likely to want to sit still, I think that schools are a difficult place for them to connect with, and therefore, when they go into the college setting, they're less likely to go. That's the biggest thing. And right now we're seeing it get down to where I believe it's heading towards 60% of colleges now are girls. It's basically like 57%, and they're saying that it'll rise to 60%. And, where does that stop? I mean, are we going to get to where no boy wants to go to college? And then, as you pointed out, I mean, colleges in the academic world have gotten much more hostile to men. If you go in a class and they're talking about you as some type of pervert, racist, pedophile, whatever, I mean, a man is not going to feel good in a setting like that. And the other thing is our speech codes are so draconian now, and the sexual sort of assault and sexual harassment codes are so difficult for boys that they often, it's a difficult environment to deal with. One of the things that's really concerning is the Obama letter that was sent out in 2011. It was a Dear Colleague letter that told colleges that take federal funds, told them that they needed to lower the preponderance of evidence from basically a higher level to a lower one, where if a guy is charged with sexual assault, they only need 50% evidence or a little over 50% to charge him, with having committed that assault. And that's a very serious charge. I mean, to charge somebody with a sexual assault can harm a young man's career. They can maybe not finish college. They can be thrown out of school. And we just don't take those things as seriously as we do for women. We just wouldn't allow that to happen in today's world to women.
The last decade has seen the entry of the unfortunate phrase, the man cave, enter the vocabulary. What does the rise of the man cave say about the decline of men?
Well, I mean, in the old days, Brett McKay actually did a beautiful post. He wrote The Art of Manliness along with his wife. I believe her name is Kay, but they do the Art of Manliness books. But he wrote a wonderful piece on the decline of male space. And one of the things he talks about is how in the old days, men had more, you saw Dad with his slippers and a pipe, and he was right upstairs, maybe in the living room or the den. Now it seems like men are relegated to the worst part of the house, maybe the garage or the basement. And I think what it says is that even though a lot of men, I think, enjoy dark spaces or like being downstairs, a lot of times I think it's just a portion of the house that's allotted to the man that's just, because the whole house is sort of run by the women and the children now, and Dad is just an afterthought if he's available in the house at all. I mean, a large majority of boys and girls are growing up without dads at all. But if they have one, a lot of times Dad's in the basement, or it's all about how a woman allows him to have this space in the house, and it's like the house now is the woman's, and a guy's just allowed to live there. And I think that the decline of male space in our society, in the 80s, there was just a lot of regulations about, male-only clubs. We even see, so many things are heavily regulated. We don't even see the Elks Club or all those kinds of places. Men are discouraged from congregating together, and when they do, they're either made fun of or they're shut down. Even in schools, one of the things that was interesting is I went around to try to find men's centers, and the truth is there are only, I think, 2 in the United States of colleges that even have a men's center. And everyone says, well, the whole campus is a men's center, but actually that's not the truth. a lot of guys, when I talked to men who actually had formed a men's law group in one of the big public colleges, and one of the heads of this law group told me that they really didn't feel welcome in the environment. They felt like they couldn't really open their mouth, that if they wanted to talk, they really needed to go off campus to do so. And this really sounds to me like how women might have felt maybe in the 1950s or something.
Helen, your blog is one of the most popular at PJ Media, and there are a number of comments from your readers quoted in Men on Strike. Could you talk a bit about how the blog posts you wrote and the response to them by your commenters led to the new book and the process in writing it?
Yes, I actually, I stupidly about 5 years ago, I think I had, or maybe it was 6 years ago, I did a blog post asking men, just asking men should they get married, and I was sitting, there thinking like, oh well, there's some nice reasons men should get married, but all the men on my blog really set me straight, and they really got me thinking and let me know that something, it is not such a good deal for us. It's really, as time goes on, so many men are afraid of the legal aspects, the psychological aspects, where a lot of the men on my blog mentioned that they, were cut off from friendships, they were cut off from spending time with family, friends, and some of the research bears this out. And I know, well, I don't know if you call this research, but I know there was an article I was reading that was Men's Health, and they talked about how it was so important for men to be around their friends, and that actually it's worse for men, for men's self-esteem to have not to be around friends when they're married, because men tend to be more loners and they don't connect as well. And to lose that during a marriage is to isolate them more, and maybe you see more of a rise in depression in men, which of course, turning that around can lead to the suicide that we were talking about earlier. That's an extreme form. But going back to the blog post, yeah, everything I learned a lot from the internet, but it was also from my experience having worked 20 years before with so many men, and I've evaluated, probably 5,000 or 6,000 individuals, at least half, probably more of them being men and boys, and just hearing from them and hearing. I think the great thing about the blogosphere is that you can hear from so many different voices from really all over the world. That a lot of the guys I talked to were in the United States, and a lot of them actually write me from PJ Media. I mean, they write me all the time. And one of the things that really warms my heart about the book so far, of the men who have read it, it'll be readers from PJ Media, and it'll be guys who say, you know what, I got your book, and my mom or somebody didn't really understand where I was coming from, why I feel, I was always told I was cynical and depressed, I felt alone, and maybe they could, give the book to their mom, or maybe it would help maybe even a woman in their life to understand a little bit more, or at least the best thing is that it would maybe make them feel like they're not alone, like, oh, their ideas are correct, and they're feeling that things are not right, that the legal and the psychological and cultural environment there is this backlash against men, and I think we need to right that. We need, in the same way we righted it against women, we don't want to go so far the other way that we harm our men and boys who are so important to the production and to the well-being of this country.
Helen, when you discuss the topics explored in Men on Strike with people who haven't read your book or your blog, do they react negatively or surprised at the notion that men can be victims?
I don't know if I really want to call it victims. I mean, I guess in some sense that's what people say, but rather than victims, I guess, can mean to be discriminated against. Absolutely. But what do people say? I mean, it depends who you're talking to. A lot of times, for example, I was talking maybe to a liberal journalist, and they'll look surprised, and their mind is very close to that type of thing, especially older men, because they feel like they've never seen that in their lifetime. If I talk to younger guys, they totally get what I'm talking about. If I talk to women, they sometimes don't understand. Like, what I'll do with women if they talk to me a little bit, and they'll tell me, they think my book, they'll hear, if they ask what it's about, and I say Men on Strike, or why men, I just tell them it's why men don't want to get married, and they think, oh, it's a psychologist writing a cute book about how to help me learn how to rope a man or something. And in truth, that's the antithesis of what the book is about. The book is all about why, from a political and legal standpoint, men don't want to get married anymore. But what I ask women, and even men sometimes, is I'll say to them, name me, 5 legal reasons men should get married. Now, I understand the psychological ones. They want to be with a certain woman. They love this person, of course. But I say, name me 5 legal reasons. And honestly, I've not had one yet that could. So, I think that sort of opens their eyes sometimes to, and I think that the reaction from women is, I don't think women have ever put themselves in men's shoes. Women talk about being the empathetic sex, but in reality, I'm so bothered in some sense that women don't have um, empathy a lot of times for men. But at the same time, there are a lot of great women out there who, if you just sort of, if they stop and think about it, they think, oh, well, maybe that sort of makes sense. But the other thing I want to turn around and say is from a men's perspective, a lot of men just deny that this is happening. Oh, I've never had that happen, or this is ridiculous, or they want to sort of say, well, I don't believe in this. And it's kind of like there's an old saying that, you may not believe in war, but war believes in you. You may think that nothing will happen to you, but if that woman at your job points a finger at you and says you did something to her, you said something to her inappropriate, and you don't have a leg to stand on, you may be hauled before the HR department with little support, and you may find out that your rights aren't, that being a man isn't going to help you in any way, and that in fact you may be a target.
We talked about how your blog led to Men on Strike a moment ago. One of the recurring themes that Glenn Reynolds has been writing about since the early days of Instapundit, and that you also discuss in Men on Strike, is that men are invariably the butt of jokes in television advertising. How does this impact how men are viewed by society, and is there anything they can do to fight back against this?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is Jim McNamara, he's a public relations professor in Sydney, Australia, and he wrote a book called Media and Male Identity, which is just terrific. I mean, I can't say enough good things about it. It's really a little book of research. But what he found is that 69% of the times when men are portrayed in the media are negative. And I really think that affects boys and men in our society. And yes, everybody laughs and says they're the butt of, men are the butt of jokes, and they're always being beaten and hit, and women are slapping men in the face, and men can't throw a ball, the Volkswagen commercial. I think I did a post at PJ Media about that. I mean, there's just a lot of times where men are seen as sort of buffoons and deadbeats. And I think that it is very negative. It's negative for boys to see this type of thing, and it's negative for men to every time they turn on the television and I think that's also the worst part is it makes it acceptable. It's almost like when people see that, they think that that's okay in the same way that maybe a kid sees something on TV and thinks, oh, it's acceptable to talk badly to my parents because that's what they do in my favorite cartoon. It's just a negative message, and it sends a message to our society that it's acceptable to bash men and to be hateful towards them. And what can men do about it? Well, first of all, one of the things I point out in the book, and I offer a number of tips and solutions in the final chapter. One of the things that is don't laugh yourself. I mean, sure, it's funny if it's like, a comedy or whatever, and I understand, some of that stuff is funny. But when you see a man being punched in the face by a woman or another man, it's really not funny. So first of all, I'd try to control your own behavior, but also I'd tell men to call other men and women out when they're laughing at such things. Or if you see an ad, Glenn Sachs, who runs a website, glennsachs.com, who's a men's rights activist, he does a beautiful job where he'll campaign. When he sees something negative in the media, he'll get all, like the guys on his site, and they'll all campaign against it if they see something negative against men. And they've often gotten things taken down or have been very successful. So don't be afraid to, write emails. And I know a lot of PJ Media, readers are very, activist, and they will do some of those things. So I think to keep that up and to just be aware and not to put up with it when you're out in society and people are laughing, because I think when we tell or let other people think that that's acceptable behavior, then it becomes ingrained, and I just think that's a negative place to be.
Well, last question. Going forward, as more and more men see the system in general as stacked up against them, should they fight back? Should they bail out on society and go Galt, or both?
Well, in the book, I do talk about a combination of both, and I think you have to look at it as a psychologist. I look at people's sort of psychology of who are they and how do they feel. Do you feel like are you a person who likes to stand up and say, I'm not going to take this anymore? I think you have to use the strengths or the weaknesses that you have and to sort of extrapolate from there. If you feel it's something that you just don't want to handle and you feel like going Galt or just opting out. I mean, a lot of men, I see a lot of guys around, I'm from Tennessee, and a lot of guys are just riding around in their truck, drinking a beer, enjoying, they're self-employed. Maybe they have, some type of small business, and maybe they're not married, and they just enjoy doing their own thing. Or maybe they still date women, but maybe they don't want to be married. And of course, I think marriage is a great thing. My 19th anniversary is coming up on the day my book comes out, and which is really exciting. So I certainly advocate marriage, but I don't advocate it I don't advocate the legal terms out there for men at this point. But I do think, just as a man, to be aware of what's going on, and do fight back. And I do think going in, and people say, like, don't get involved, like internet chat rooms and things like that, but I don't think it's a bad thing when you see people, say, even at the Wall Street Journal or people over at the New York Times, go over there and put your 2 cents in. And I see people even over at the Atlantic, a lot of men get on that site, and they will really go after, somebody who's got something negative to say about men. And I think that's terrific, because it lets people know there's another option out there besides making fun of men and treating them as the enemy. I mean, we're all friends here. We all want to get along, and we all want to make the best of our society, hopefully, if we're decent human beings. And in that vein, I think it's important that we learn that men and boys do have feelings, and that we do need to protect, constitutionally and psychologically, those men and boys in our society, just like we do women and girls.
This has been Ed Driscoll for PJ Media, and we've been talking with Helen Smith, who blogs at pjmedia.com/Dr. Helen, and is the author of Men on Strike: Why Men Are Boycotting Marriage, Fatherhood, and the American Dream, and Why It Matters. It's published by Encounter Books and available from Amazon.com and your local bookstore. And Helen, continued success with both the book and the blog, and thank you once again for stopping by today.
Thanks so much, Ed. I really appreciate it.